But what is it that the managing broker is supposed to do? They're supposed to have a written office policy. They are responsible for the implementation of that policy. They're responsible for the training of the agents that they hire, and they are responsible for setting office commissions. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about commission when we get into our section on antitrust, but that is the managing broker's responsibilities. They're there to supervise and assist all of their agents in any of their transactions. They're there to supervise all of the advertising. They're supposed to familiarize all of the licensees they sponsor with real estate related laws and ordinances, which means I, as the managing broker, whether I have 3 people in my office or 300 people in my office, I have to make sure that I've done everything I can to make sure my agents know what's going on in the real estate business. And lastly on this list, although arguably one of the most important things, is I have an obligation as the managing broker to try to resolve any disputes between my agents and the consumers. When that consumer calls my office and says, I've had a problem with one of your agents, it is my responsibility as the managing broker to help resolve that. It doesn't mean that I throw my agent under a bus. It doesn't mean that I automatically assume my agent was right. It's my job to help figure out what happened. This is the managing broker's responsibilities. The people that, now some of you are going to be doing managing broker training. So when you get into the managing broker training, you're going to be going in depth into this. But for our broker training, we just want to make sure they understand that once they get their brokerage license, even though they're going to be independent contractors, they're not quite as independent as they thought they were. If I'm the managing broker and I'm responsible for them, as long as I don't violate these are IRS rules. I don't violate the IRS rules of the difference between an employee and an independent contractor, then I can make sure my agents toe the line, so to speak, because I'm responsible for them. So this has been upheld, this independent broker status has been upheld in the last year on both the left coast and the right coast, because there were lawsuits brought that said that I am a real estate agent and I should be an employee, and the courts have said no. The managing broker has certain rights, certain things they can make you do, even though you are an independent contractor. So agents need to be prepared for that. So one of the most important things, as I mentioned to you before, one of the things that was high on the list of where we get in trouble with the license law was agency. And I give you another suggestion, another way that you might want to teach agency is to do an agency quiz. Quizzes help them focus. And as you can see on the screen now, you have the first part of an agency quiz, questions 1 through 5. So why don't we now take a look at those 5. I'll have you answer those 5, and we'll talk about the next slide in just a moment. This slide has questions 6 through 10 on it. So take a couple of minutes to answer these questions, and then we'll take a look at the answers. Let's take a look at our agency quiz. The first one was, an implied agency relationship is created by the actions or conduct of the parties, and that is true. So if I walk and talk and act in a certain way, no matter what disclosure forms I gave, no matter what I said, if I do that and imply that I am working for somebody, and we all know that the first issue we have with agency is getting everybody to understand, and I'm going to show you in a little while how you might be able to do this with another kind of exercise, is there are times where I am not the agent of the buyer. For a quick example, if the seller said no to dual agency, I can still show the property, I can still sell the property, I can still get paid both sides of the transaction, but I was not the agent of the buyer when I did it. Now, there's all kinds of forms the buyer has to sign to acknowledge that I am not his agent, and I have him sign it. And he signs the notice of no agency form, I am not his agent. And now we get to contract stage, and the buyer says to me, well, how much do you think I should offer? And I say to the buyer, I can't tell you how much to offer because I work for the seller. I've already gone through this. And then I say, but whatever you decide to offer the seller, I'll do the best I can for you. I have just created an implied agency. By saying I'm going to do the best I can for the buyer when I'm supposed to be working for the seller was creating an agency relationship. So it doesn't make any difference what forms he signed. It's important that we make the agents understand. It's not the signing of a disclosure form that's important. It's our behavior all the way through the transaction. So the answer to number 1 was true. Number 2 was an express agreement is created usually by a written agreement, but can be created by orally expressing intentions to represent a client, and that one is also true. So for example, here in Illinois, I am presumed to be the agent of the person with whom I am working. I do not have to have anything in writing to create that agency relationship. It's an express relationship. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we're going to go out and look at houses. I'm your agent. I'm here to look out for your best interests. The biggest issue there is, do I want to have them on a contract? It doesn't make any difference. If I want an exclusive agreement with them, then I have to have them on contract. But I don't have to have the buyer on a contract, but I'm still the agent of the buyer. So understanding that, and my duties don't change whether I have them on contract or not. So state of Illinois, in my opinion, and I will share this with you to share however you want, I do a lot of instructing for the National Association of Realtors, and I've taught in over 40 different states. I know the license laws, not as well as I know Illinois, but I know their license laws. Illinois' license law is one of the best to protect the consumer because it says we are presumed to be the agent of the client with whom we are working, and we do not need anything in writing to create that agency relationship. It's good for the consumer. It makes it more difficult for us to get a buyer agency agreement signed, but it is best for the consumer. And that's, remember, what the license law is there for. So number 3 said, in a real estate transaction, the selling agent's client would be the seller, and that is false. Now, why did I even throw that crazy question in there, and why am I suggesting you might want to have this conversation? Because they are confused. We refer to the listing agent as the person who had the listing and represented the seller. But we have this bad habit of referring to the person who represented the buyer as the selling agent because they were the one who sold it. That is a nutty, crazy thing because what we should be saying is listing agent and buyer's agent. So the more we as instructors can stop saying selling agent, listing agent, selling agent, and we can try to start saying listing agent, buyer's agent, it will help to clear this up for the new kids, I think, as well as for the consumer. Because this whole reference to selling agent makes it sound like we were working for the seller. So we're using, it makes sense if you really analyze it, but I'm suggesting that we as instructors might want to start using listing agent, buyer's agent to help them to get away from this confusion. Number 4 was Illinois law does not include tenants of residential property as clients. That one is also false. Hopefully we're getting beyond this now, but I think it's still worthy for a while yet to reinforce this. We had a lot of problems for a while of people thinking that I don't have to do the same thing with a tenant, prospective tenant, as I have to do with a prospective buyer. Every single disclosure form, everything we do with buyers, we must also do with a tenant relationship as well. So just a reminder for the agents that it's the same. And number 5, ministerial acts needs written disclosure prior to the consumer disclosing any confidential information. That is true. And the issue of ministerial acts is very confusing yet to the licensees. You're going to be their first touch point on this and getting them to understand that ministerial acts means that I am not their agent. I can still work with them. I do not work for them. And I know this sounds like we're splitting hairs, but I think we as instructors need to be very careful. If I'm working for someone, then I'm their agent. If I'm working with someone, then I am not their agent. I'm just facilitating that sale. So ministerial acts is what the license law calls it when I am not the agent of someone. And I've got an example of how you can help them understand the difference coming up in just a minute. Number 6, that question is false. And it said dual agency does not need disclosure until the licensee is preparing a contract to purchase. Big false. I should have put that in capital letters. Dual agency is really, really a problem, not in practice as much as it's a problem in execution. I don't know if that makes sense, but here's the issue. If I represent both the buyer and the seller, then I cannot give them full service, and they have to acknowledge that it's okay, that I am more of I'm going to use the word facilitator again. I'm more there to facilitate the transaction. I cannot tell the buyer anything I know about the seller. I can't tell the seller anything I know about the buyer. I have to keep all of their information confidential. That disclosure in Illinois, here's how it works, and this is a good way to explain it. It needs disclosure 3 times. Once, it needs permission 3 times, not just disclosure. Once, when I took the listing, the seller has to give me permission to be a dual agent. Otherwise, I don't even know how to work with the buyer when the buyer wants to see the property. Before I show the property to the buyer has to give me permission for dual agency, so he understands that I work for both of them. And then if the buyer wants to put an offer in on my sales contract, and every sales contract in the state, let me rephrase that, every sales contract in the state that I've seen so far has on there that the confirmation of consent to dual agency. It should be the first thing that the agents have the buyer initial before they fill out the contract. And when they go to present that offer to the seller, it should be the first thing that the seller initials on the contract before they continue to go on. Because what the license law says is that this is the last, it's kind of like getting a ticket in an accident. It was the last clear chance to avoid an accident. This is the last clear chance to avoid a dual agency. Could the buyer or the seller at the time right now go, I don't think I like dual agency the more I think about it? The answer is they could, and we'd have to refer one of them to somebody else to get full representation. So once when I take the listing, permission from the seller. When I go to show the property, permission from the buyer. Buyer wants to write, I now have to get confirmation of the fact they told me it was okay on that contract. Problem is most of the agents are waiting till they do the contract. They didn't get the 2 original permissions. They're doing it only at the time of contract. So it's important for us to reiterate to them how dual agency needs to be disclosed, because it is a problem when not disclosed properly. So dual agency, the execution of the dual agency isn't the problem as much as the disclosure of it, which is really foolish to get in trouble for something which was as simple as making sure those papers were signed at the right time. Number 7 says confidential information remains confidential after the termination of the agency relationship unless it is released by the client or becomes public knowledge, and that is pretty much textbook definition of confidential information. So example you might give is, and all of you, if you've been out there selling real estate, you're now getting your instructor's license. I'm just trying to give you some, use my examples till you come up with your own if you're a new instructor. That's the whole idea of this, is for us as the experienced instructors to help you through this. This example, best one I can give, is I have a listing, and while I have it listed, an offer came in on the property. My seller countered back to the buyer at $400,000 on a $425,000 listing. Countered back at $400,000. Buyer didn't take the counter and they walked away. The listing expires, and it's now listed by Betty Boop at Grope and Fumble Real Estate. So Betty's got the listing, and I now have a buyer for the property. It's still listed at $425,000. My buyer says, how much should I offer? I cannot tell the buyer that the seller was willing to take $400,000 2 days ago. Anything I know about the seller has to stay confidential, even though I am no longer the agent of the seller. Confidential information stays confidential until it's public knowledge or released by the client. In this case, it's not public knowledge, and it's not been released by the client, so I cannot disclose it. So the question always comes up, and you might get the question, how long? To infinity and beyond, as Buzz Lightyear said. It doesn't make, eventually it becomes moot, Who cares if the house goes on the market 2 years from now, what the seller was willing to take today? But common sense says just keep it confidential forever. Anything you know personally about the clients stays confidential. Number 8 says, Illinois law allows dual agency on licensee's property only with full disclosure, and that is false. Absolutely cannot do dual agency on property we own or have an interest in. This is part of what our agents have gotten in trouble for, our licensees have gotten in trouble for with IDFPR. If I own the property, I cannot be a dual agent. I have to do ministerial acts with the buyer. I can still sell my own house. I just cannot be representing the buyer when I do it. If you just think about this for a minute, it doesn't even make any sense. How in the world can I represent both my own self and the buyer at the same time? Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I own the property. I do not represent you. If you want representation, I can refer you to someone who can give you representation, but please understand, if you want to buy my house, you are literally acting as your own agent. And we have them sign the notice of no agency form. The notice of no agency form, and by the way, those forms, you can tell the licensees, are going to come from if they join an office that belongs to the Realtor Association, then the Illinois Association of Realtors has provided all of those forms for us. If they choose to join an office that does not belong to the Realtor Association, then the individual real estate company will have created the forms for them. Here in Illinois, as you know, the forms are not created by IDFPR. They are created by, they leave it up to us in the field to create the forms. So the managing broker will have done it, or they will be using IAR, the Illinois Association of Realtors forms, if they are a Realtor office. So the form that we use is the Notice of No Agency form, and I suggest that you suggest to them that it's on that form that they also write that they are the owner of the property, because remember a little earlier we talked about, does the licensee have to disclose that they are in fact a licensee? Yes. So if there's a form they have to give the buyer that says I'm not your agent, wouldn't it make sense then to put on that form, just write on there, that the other disclosure I'm giving you is that I am the owner of the property? No dual agency. And this whole idea of I can do it if I disclose it, so impress upon them that no dual agency if they own or have an interest in the property. Number 9 says you are the agent of the person who is paying you. False. And an example you can give to them, so this kind of brings it home, is if there was a for sale by owner property and I represented the buyer, I'm going to bring my buyer to the for sale by owner. I will already have discussed with the for sale by owner that I represent the buyer, given the for sale by owner the Notice of No Agency form, but also had them sign an agreement to compensate me as the agent of the buyer. So can I now sell the for sale by owner by representing only the buyer and get paid by the seller? And the answer is yes. And that is how selling for sale by owners, as you all know, that's how it works. But it's an example of how to, where we might not be the agent of the person who is paying us. The other really obvious example is that if they do become realtors and they put their listings into the multiple listing service, the seller, through the listing agent, is offering compensation to the cooperating broker, and that is arguably coming from the seller. I work for the buyer, we go to the closing, out of the compensation the seller is paying the listing office is paying the buyer broker's office, and I don't work for the seller. So the license law is clear. There's even a statement in the license law that says that compensation and agency are not necessarily tied together. So it's an important concept to make sure that the agents understand. And number 10, although Illinois law does not require that the buyer sign the disclosure of designated agency form, it is good business practice to obtain their signature or initials, and that is true. The way it stands right now in the license law, I have to disclose to every buyer that I work with that I am their designated agent. Designated agency confuses the fill in the blank out of pretty much everybody. Designated agency is something we created in the license law in Illinois to protect the consumer, by the way. Because if we went under the common law of agency, The common law of agency says that if I am the managing broker and I have 20 people who work for me, I created the agency relationship with the clients because my agents do not have the ability to enter into contractual agreements with the buyers and sellers. So that means I, as the managing broker, or the brokerage company, do that. Under the common law of agency, the minute I enter into that agreement, all of the people who work for me automatically became agents of that seller whose listing agreement I signed. So now one of my 20 people has a buyer for that property. That means that all of us, because I'm the one that is the agent of the buyer, so is Sally, the agent who's working with them, but so are the other 19 people in my office, which would mean that anytime anybody in my office had a buyer for any listing in our office, it would be a dual agency. And that means that the clients are not 100% represented. That is not in the best interest of the consumer. What's in the best interest of the consumer is what we created here in Illinois 20-something years ago, and that is something called designated agency. I, the managing broker, designate in writing to the seller that the listing agent, Joe, is the only agent they have. The rest of the people in our office do not work for that seller. Now when Sally has a buyer, I designate to the buyer that Sally is the only agent the buyer has, and now Sally, the rest of you don't work for Sally's buyer. Now Sally can sell Joe's listing. She represents the buyer, Joe represents the seller, and there is no dual agency. That is absolutely in the best interest of the consumer, and that's why we do it. But they need to know that we do designated agency, because if Sally's buyer runs into Joe at a basketball game or a picnic or whatever, realizes they work for Madison Realty, and Sally's buyer starts chatting with Joe about the house he's trying to buy and how much they love it and how much they really want to live 3 doors away from their cousin and all the rest of it, and they're in the middle of negotiating a contract, Joe's responsibility now is to tell his seller what the buyer just said, because he's not the agent of the buyer. Designated agency means, see, this is the way I usually explain it. Designated agency should come with a roll of duct tape. Because Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if you want to have a conversation about the house you're buying, you need to have it with me, possibly my managing broker, but certainly with nobody else from my office, because the rest of the people in my office don't work for you. We could spend, and you as experienced agents who are getting involved in becoming instructors, you have your own stories for this. Probably every one of you has an example of some buyer who has said something and it got back to the seller because, here's an example, they posted on Facebook, for goodness sakes. They post on Facebook that they found the perfect house and they are in the middle of negotiating and they really love it. And then it turns out that somebody's a friend of a friend, the 2 real estate agents are, and then I see it, or Joe sees it, because Sally's buyer posted it. I mean, it just becomes a what? A nightmare. They need to understand they shouldn't be doing any of that. So designated agency, yes, we have to disclose designated agency with every buyer that we are working with. So these are what I just pulled out as 10 concepts that are important for everybody to understand when it comes to agency. You know what you need to be teaching to on the exam. You use whatever examples you want to use, but I just think doing a little quiz sometimes is a good way to kind of bring the whole idea home to them. So the whole issue of duties versus responsibilities to customers. We have duties to clients, and I'll just put these up there a little quickly. I've always taught the duties that we have. There's different ways you can do this, but the duties we have to our clients, I've always used the old car, and usually put pictures of old cars and all that kind of stuff up. I owe my clients obedience, loyalty, disclosure. Obedience meaning I have to follow all of their lawful instructions, not illegal instructions, but lawful instructions. I have 100% undivided loyalty to my client. I put their interests ahead of everyone else's, including my own. I owe them full disclosure about everything that is going on with this real estate transaction. I owe them confidentiality. I am not ever going to give their confidential information to anyone. I owe them accounting. I have to account for any monies that come into my, any monies or personal property that I have. That's pretty obvious. And then reasonable care. The reasonable care is where we fall off the way. There's no list of reasonable care. I've asked attorneys, describe for me what reasonable care means, and most of them will say something like, I don't think the courts have finally decided yet what that is. Here's the one thing that I think we can bring home to our licensees. IDFPR and the courts will hold us to a higher level of what's reasonable care than the consumer, and disclosure, than the consumer themselves is held. In other words, they don't know what they don't know. We know how to look out for them. My responsibility is to make sure that my buyer, for example, gets all of the mandatory disclosure forms required in Illinois. I'm supposed to make sure that that happens. I'm the buyer agent. Buyers don't know what the disclosure forms are. So is it my responsibility to make sure they got it all? Absolutely. Is it my responsibility to recommend they have a home inspection done? Absolutely. Is it my responsibility to, if the transaction warrants it, recommend that they have an attorney get involved? Absolutely. They don't know all of that. So my point is, my job is to look out for them where they don't even know they need looking out for. Because I'm the expert, I'm supposed to take care of them. So what responsibilities do I have to my customers? I don't have any duties to a customer. I'm not the agent of a customer. So if I'm doing ministerial acts with someone, I owe them honesty. I can't lie to them. I owe all of this to my client, but I have to be honest with the other side to the transaction. I owe them accounting, obviously, if I have money or personal property. I owe them reasonable skill. Reasonable skill is really, what does it say in the license law that I have to do? The license law is the bare minimum. So I have to give them that. But I don't have to give them the reasonable care, which goes beyond that. Reasonable care, as I said, was that I have to look out for their best interest. I'm not looking out for this guy's best interest because he's not my what? He's not my client, especially if I represent the other side in the transaction. You will get, and as experienced agents, you've already experienced it in the field, the issue of dual agency is bad. I got news for you. Dual agency is better than doing ministerial acts with somebody. Because at least with dual agency, I'm not throwing either one of them under a bus. If I represent the seller and I do not represent the buyer, because the seller said no to dual agency or my company policy says no to dual agency, I have a real problem with that because I don't think the buyers always understand that what that means is anything you say or do, I'm going to turn around and tell my seller everything. So if the buyer were to say, I want to offer $150,000 on this $175,000 listing, I'm going to offer $150,000, I'll go as high as $165,000. If I'm a dual agent, I do not tell my seller that because telling my seller that would bring harm to the other client. But if I'm doing ministerial acts and the buyer's only my customer, the minute he said I'll go to $165,000, do I now have an obligation to tell my seller that although he's offering $150,000, he'll go to $165,000? And the answer is yes, I do. So understanding that there's a difference between reasonable skill and reasonable care, but then there's an M in there. You'll notice how I came up with harm on that side. Material fact disclosure. So it's important that we remind the clients that, the licensees, that regardless of whether this person is my client or my customer, I must disclose any material facts about the property of which I have knowledge. So if I have a seller, and I know we have a seller disclosure form, let's not get hung up on that at the moment. I have a seller who has a roof problem with their property. They haven't fixed it yet, but they're going to. But they haven't fixed it yet. And this could come from the house was on the market, the seller, there was a contract on it, the buyer had a home inspection done, the home inspector said we have a roof problem. My seller says, I'm not going to change my seller disclosure form because I'm going to fix the roof, but in that 3 or 4 days before the roof is fixed, we now have a buyer for the property. Do I have an obligation to disclose at this moment in time that there's a problem with the roof, regardless of whether or not the buyer is my client or my customer? The answer is yes, and even beyond that. Do I, as a listing agent now, have an obligation to disclose to you, the buyer agent, that at this moment in time, we have a roof problem? And the answer is yes, I do. Material facts are never confidential information, always have to be disclosed. And that's an important concept to make sure that the agents understand. So those are duties versus the responsibilities. So as I said before, reasonable skill is only what the license law requires. Reasonable care and diligence is to protect the client from foreseeable risks and harm, and that's our responsibility to see down the road. We're the professionals. We're the ones who are supposed to look out for them. Huge responsibilities. And I think it's up to us as the instructors, whether it's in pre-license or post-license, to keep reminding them how important their job is. Anybody who gets into the real estate business just to make money is a fool, because if you really start, you can make a lot of money in the real estate business, but with that comes some responsibility, and the responsibility is we got to look out for our clients, and we have to protect them, and we need to know what that means. And I think it's up to us as instructors to make sure that we try to bring that home to them. So we talked about the confidential information. Remains confidential after the termination of the agency relationship, ceases to be confidential when it's released or it becomes public knowledge. I think I've already covered that. I did it a little bit before. The ministerial acts, I think we've pretty much covered that one as well. What we do when we are not the agent of someone. Disclosure must be given. Notice of no agency, we had to do that. Can't be a dual agent if one of the parties said no to dual agency. So a way you might be able to kind of bring home the difference between doing ministerial acts and doing dual agency if they are going to sell their own property is a little exercise. So what can you do? So the example here would be exactly what I just said. I am the listing agent. I have a buyer for the property. Seller said no to dual agency, so the buyer is my customer, the seller is my client. So here's a list of things that would happen in the transaction. What can I do if I am doing ministerial acts with the buyer? So why don't you take just a couple of minutes just to see how this exercise would play out in your classrooms. Why don't you take a minute to go ahead and do it? Okay, let's look at this. Could I attend the open house and respond to questions about the property? And the answer is yes, I can. There's only 3 things on here that I cannot do if I am doing ministerial acts. I cannot assist the buyer to develop the terms of an offer or a counteroffer. That is an agency level service. So if the buyer says, how much should I offer, what should I do, all I am is the what? I'm the messenger here. I cannot help the buyer with this. I do not keep the buyer's information confidential. We talked about that. I'm going to throw the buyer under a bus on behalf of my seller client. And then number 7, doing a CMA for the buyer and suggesting an offering price. Now, if in fact the seller said I could do that, then I could. But let's face it, we all know that most of the time the sellers have their houses listed higher than what they're going to accept an offer for. I can't tell the seller how much I can't even do a CMA for this buyer. I have to say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, that's something you're going to have to discover on your own. I'm sorry, I have a real problem with ministerial acts with the buyers, but that's not to say, I didn't say it, I said I had a problem with it. It's still legal to do it that way. But those are the things that we cannot do. So the next one is just a reminder on dual agency. On dual agency, we are representing both the buyer and the seller. The form has to be signed by the seller at the time of listing. The form has to be signed by the buyer before we show the property. The confirmation is done at the time of the contract. If either one of them says no during any part of this, we have to refer them to someone else. So this little exercise you can use is to show the difference between, I now have a buyer, I am the listing agent, and I have a buyer for the property, and I am a dual agent. So unlike the other one where the buyer was my customer, now I have 2 clients. So now take a couple of minutes to just kind of run through these 12, and you decide whether or not this is something I can or cannot do as a dual agent. So let's look at this. Now we have a number of things that we cannot do. Certainly I can provide pricing information to both of my clients. Yes, I will do a CMA for the buyer. And when I took the listing and the seller gave me permission for dual agency, As you all know as experienced agents, now getting into the training side of the business, we had this conversation with the seller when we took the listing, but it's important for us to make sure that the agents have done the same thing. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, whether it is myself who has the buyer for the property and I represent the buyer, or another agent that does, they're going to be doing a CMA for the buyer before the buyer puts in an offer. You want to list your house at $400,000, and the CMA is showing it should sell between $300,000 and $325,000. If I put your house on the market at $400,000, your offers are still probably going to come in between $300,000 and $325,000 because that's where the CMA is showing. That's what the CMA is showing. So if I do put it on at $400,000, let's not even get into whether I should or shouldn't. If I did, I'm still going to be doing a CMA for the buyer at, it's going to show to $300,000 to $325,000. It's my job. And when the seller says, I don't want you to tell the buyer that, then you got to say, then I'm not going to be able to do dual agency because I cannot mislead the buyer as to the value of the property. I won't be telling the buyer how much to offer, but I will be using the CMA. By the way, just a little aside, most of you, if you are realtors, you know about the designations from NAR. One of those designations is ABR, the Accredited Buyer Representative. I happen to be one of the authors of the course for NAR. And when we put the course together, we talk about this in the course. And NAR's legal, as they vet everything we write, they came back and they suggested that we suggest to you that you use exactly the same CMA with the buyer that you used with the seller, updated if it's got any age to it. In other words, if it was 30 days ago that I did it for the seller, then I need to update the seller's information when I do it for the buyer. In other words, if I'm a dual agent and I'm helping negotiate a contract, they both have exactly the same information. Because yes, and this is a huge issue for a lot of people because they don't think they should be doing a CMA for the buyer when they're a dual agent. It's like, how can't you? You represent what? You represent both of them. Of course, we're going to disclose the defects. I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want to make sure I went through number one. We're not going to tell the buyer how much the seller wants to sell their home for. We are not going to tell the seller how high the buyer is willing to go. I'm a dual agent. I don't disclose either one of those. I don't do 7 through 11. And by the way, if you think about it, other than 7, some of this is exactly what's on the dual agency disclosure form. Number 7, though, says, assist the buyer by recommending what they ask the seller to repair after the inspection. There's no problem with suggesting the buyer have a home inspection done. But one of the things you may want to talk to the agents about is the danger after the home inspection is done of recommending to the buyer what they ask the seller to repair, because this is where we see some problems with dual agency. If I recommend to the buyer that they not ask the seller to repair anything, it looks like I'm working for the seller. If I recommend to the buyer they ask for everything, it looks like to the seller I'm working more for the buyer. This is where supply and demand comes in again. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, what the home inspector found was mostly cosmetic, nothing material. We were in a multiple offer when we got the house. You can do whatever you want to here, but I'm going to strongly suggest to you that you might not want to be asking the seller to do a lot of nitpicky things to the house for fear that if the seller says no to that, that they might be able to sell the house to somebody else who was trying to buy it. This is what I would suggest you do anytime you're in a multiple offer, by the way. But when you're a dual agent, this is a tough one. This is a tough one. So some discussion on that. We do not disclose to the buyer the seller's motivation for selling. I don't disclose to the seller the buyer's motivation for buying. The minute I say the buyer is a transferee coming here being transferred by their company, have I just watered down my buyer's negotiating position? And the answer is, of course I have. I see buyer agents do this all the time. Well, he's a transferee and he has to be here by what, the end of the month. Well, thank you very much for that. Because now I know my seller can, drive a harder bargain, if you will, because we know buyer's got a deadline to meet. So be careful with that. Advise the buyer on how much to offer. Advise the seller on how to counteroffer. We don't do any of that. So this example, these 2 examples are something you can use to kind of show the difference between ministerial acts, buyer is the customer, and dual agency where the buyer is in fact the client. So just a couple of suggestions on how to bring it home to your students. We have minimum service laws in Illinois. Minimum services means that any exclusive agreement that I have with the consumer must contain this. In other words, I will be accepting delivery of and presenting to my client all of the offers and counteroffers that come in on the property. I have to be available to my client to assist in developing any counteroffers and communication and negotiating back and forth, and be available to my clients for the answering of all questions relating to the transaction, all the way through to the removal of all of the contingencies. Minimum services is only on exclusive agreements. So it's exclusive buyer agency agreements, exclusive listing agreements, but in either case, I have to give my clients minimum services. So as you all know, that means that I cannot put a listing in the MLS, abandon the seller, and tell him he's going to negotiate directly with the buyer agents. That is a violation of license law because, with rare exception, the MLSs do not accept anything other than exclusive listings. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but minimum services is part of that whole agency issue as well. Now, I debated for us here in the instructor development whether I should have started with antitrust a little bit sooner, and I decided as instructors we can handle this, but I will say to you as instructors that in many, many of the courses that I write for continuing education, and even in some of the pre-licensing stuff that I do, I start with some antitrust discussion, even if it's buried in the book back in chapter 87 or something, because you've got to get it out on the table, because some of the questions, especially the new kids might ask, new kids, and they're not even our kids yet. Do you know what I mean? We haven't even they're going to get you in antitrust territory. So just a couple of reminders with antitrust. Price fixing can come into this whole discussion we're going to have, because we're going to talk about listing agreements and buyer agency agreements next, or shortly. We cannot imply or state in any way that the commissions were fixed or we had collusion between real estate companies. As I said earlier, every managing broker has the ability to decide how much the commission is going to be for their office, but more importantly than that, we need to teach the agents about how to talk about compensation. I know here's the problem as pre-licensed instructors. You have a lot to cover, and antitrust is a little minuscule amount of what you need to cover. I get that. And I know this is going to be more my responsibility or your responsibility if you're going to do post-licensing as well. We're going to have to really make sure we cover this when we get them into the offices and into the associations, because I know you don't have a lot of time to cover it, but it's important that this concept be out there. More importantly, right now, I'm worried about you guys, because if you as an instructor don't know how to handle antitrust discussions within your classrooms, you're going to create your own problems. You've got to talk about it in generic ways. I use X's and Y's and Z's rather than 6s and 7s and 8s, or 3s or 2s. I use the X's, Y's, and Z's. On occasion, I cannot use X's and Y's and Z's because it's going to lose the whole point of it. You can sometimes see their eyes glaze over, or they start doing one of these eyeballs to the left or right when you know you lost them. And sometimes I will say, okay, I can't use my X's and Y's in this one. I'm going to use numbers, and then I use my antitrust disclaimer. This is for educational purposes only. No one is suggesting or recommending these are the commissions that you charge the sellers or how much you pay out to the co-op brokers. We're doing this just for educational purposes only. Here's something you can't do. I had a huge discussion with NAR Legal about this because a couple of the other instructors, one of the other things I do is instructor development for the National Association. So I end up doing train the trainer stuff for NAR. And one of the instructors there was telling everybody one day in a class, and we had about 60 instructors there, that this is how she does it. I don't say percent, I say 6 buttons or 5 buttons. I don't care if you call it buttons, cans of dog food, or whatever. When you start using numbers, you're using numbers. So do your disclaimer and use X's and Y's and Z's unless you absolutely have to with the commissions. The length of the listing, there is no length of listing. If we all got together and said we were only going to list houses for at least a year, then that's boycott. I mean, that's antitrust. So it's entirely up to the real estate brokerage companies to decide that, and also at the length of the protection period. As you know, as in any listing agreement that we have in the state, and in any exclusive buyer agency agreement, if we use a protection period, and we all do, the protection period cannot be fixed. In other words, if I put in my listing agreement that the seller was going to owe us a commission if he sold the property to any buyer we showed it to, after our listing expires, if I wanted to put 30 days in there, 60 days, 90 days, that's my protection period. A license law only requires us to then put in there unless they've listed with another brokerage company. But the length of that protection period can't be fixed either. So, and the reason I brought these things up is that these are the questions that come up in pre-licensing by the students is, well, what is the commission that we charge? How much money are we going to make when we do this? How long do we have? So know that you can't answer those questions. You need to say that's going to be a brokerage company decision. That's the easiest way to handle it. The issue of boycotting, I think, is more a problem after they've been licensed and they get contaminated by the other agents, because I think brand new kids aren't even thinking about this. But we cannot all get together, or you and I get together and decide we don't like the way Titanic does business, so we're not going to show Titanic Realty's listings. That's a boycott. We don't do it, and you just need to make sure that they are aware of that. So a couple of prevention tips with the whole antitrust. A brokerage company should be analyzing the market and deciding on what their commissions are going to be independently of any other brokerage company. So let's be honest. If I looked in the MLS and I saw the offer of compensation being made to the brokers, to the buyer brokers who bring us a buyer on our listings, might it look like there was some similarity between those numbers? By the way, that's called parallel activity, and an example you can use to explain this is gasoline prices. If you had 3 gas stations on the corner, and sometimes there are, when one of them changes their prices, it does seem kind of weird that the other 2 get up there with their big long sticks and change the prices right after they do. Well, here's the problem. If this guy changed the price of his gas by 10 cents a gallon, it was because it was costing him more to bring the gas in. If it's costing him more, then it's probably costing those 2 guys more. It's called parallel activity. Airlines have the same issue. We could make the argument that we think it's antitrust, that when one airline raises their fares to New York City, it seems like every airline does it right after that. But they make the argument of parallel activity. We can too. It costs my real estate company a finite amount of money to keep its doors open. I have to pay a competitive commission to my agents, or I won't have any agents. Does that then lend itself to it being similar in the marketplace? Yes, that's an answer, not a we all got together and decided this is what we were going to charge. This is not something that you necessarily need to be concerned about with the pre-licensing, but if you get into the broker management pre-licensing part, they cannot pre-print or typeset, and I know that's an old-fashioned word, but I don't know what other word to use. I cannot take the board's listing agreement, the association listing agreement, turn it into a Word file, take out the blank where the commission now goes, no blank, and type in a number, and then turn it back into a PDF. And now hand it to my agents and say, go forth and use this. So now it's got a number in there, a 6 or a 7 or an 8 or a 5, I don't care what it is. And now it looks like the board or association put into their agreement that the commission was going to be X. Huge problem if the managing brokers are doing this. Now, if I have my own listing agreement, I don't use the board's listing agreement, I use Madison Realty's listing agreement. Can I put my numbers in there? Can I put my number in for my protection period? My length of the listing? Yes, I can. I just can't do it in a board listing agreement. So wanted to mention it here because I know some of you will get involved in doing the broker stuff as well. The broker should have a written antitrust policy, and agents should understand they should not be having conversations with about their company policy on commissions or any of what we've talked about with agents from other companies. And agents should be taught how to differentiate themselves between here's what is not being taught, and we don't have time in pre-licensing to do it, but the agents need to understand they need to go to work for a managing broker who's going to take the time to teach them this. What is my value to the seller? What is my value to the buyer? What do I bring to the table that makes me worth this amount of money? Not because everybody else charges that. New agents don't have they don't have the strength yet to be able to say, I'm worth this amount of money, because they haven't been taught how to do it. So we've got to be careful that our new agents out there are not out there creating some problems. Some phrases to avoid, I'll just put them up there. I think you all know what they are, but you see them on the slide that you have. It's something that you might want to make sure you reinforce with them. This is what everybody charges. It's standard. The MLS won't accept it. The MLS does not have any policy on how long your listings have to be for, but that's a fallback position to get the listing for a longer period of time. And then most people don't want to list with another real estate company, and here's all the reasons why. That should never, it should be why you should list with me, not why you shouldn't list with the other guys. So if we can get them to do their listings from their seller counseling from more of a positive rather than a negative, I think it would help.